Good evening. I was asked to bring you tonight a revolutionary text. I was asked to bring you a text that we need in this country right now, a text that will enable us to speak Torah to power. But first, a story. One night, Tyrone was standing in front of a bodega, convenience store, and he was drinking a soda with a straw. The police came up and arrested him. The charge, possession of drug paraphernalia. Apparently, you can use a straw to carry heroin. The prosecutors offered him a deal. Plead guilty and spend just 30 days in Rikers Island, the notorious, violence-ridden New York City jail. Tyrone refused to plead guilty for drinking a soda with a straw. Bail was set at $1,500, an amount that he could never afford, nor could anyone in his family. He urged the police to please test the straw. He was sent to Rikers Island. After 5 days, he was called up for a hearing. At the hearing, the prosecutors offered the same deal. Plead guilty now and spend 30 days in Rikers Island. Again, he refused to plead guilty for drinking soda with a straw. He was sent back to Rikers Island. Sometime in the next 2 weeks, he was beaten terribly. His eyes were swollen shut. His face was battered and bruised. He said he looked like Frankenstein's brother. 15 days after the first hearing, he was brought back again. And the prosecutors had the test results. The straw, of course, had only soda in it. Tyrone was allowed to go home. He spent 20 days in Rikers Island. He was beaten terribly for the crime of drinking soda while black, for the crime of being too poor to have $1,500 available. Since my congregation has been working on community organizing to address systemic racism in the criminal justice system, we have heard many stories like Tyrone's. Too many stories. Some of them have ended in death. Just last week, we had an action around bail reform, and Akeem Browder came to speak. Akeem is the brother of Khalif Browder, whose name has tragically become well known, because when Khalif was 16 years old, he was picked up by police for allegedly stealing a backpack. There was never any evidence produced that he had contact with this backpack, but he was thrown in Rikers Island after being unable to meet bail. And he was there for 3 years waiting for a trial that never came. Never did he have a chance to tell his side of the story. Never did he have a chance he was never even proven guilty. There was never evidence presented against him. 3 years he was on Rikers Island, and for much of that time he was held in solitary confinement. He was beaten repeatedly. And after 3 years, the case was just thrown out because it had no merit. And he went home, and he killed himself. And his mother, who'd been heartbroken for 3 years, had a heart attack, and she died. And Akeem came to tell us that story. Tonight, there are 4,000 people in New York City jails because they're too poor to pay bail. They're in jail because they're poor. They've never had a trial, but they're in jail. That is wrong. There are so many issues that pull at our attention right now. So many crises happening every day. So many things to think about and focus on. It can be overwhelming. Whether it is systemic racism in our criminal legal system and in policing and in other places in our country, or whether it's the rise of strongmen and authoritarian regimes in our world and the erosion of democracies, or whether it's gun violence and the fear of children and teenagers and adults to be able to go to public places or their schools because they're afraid they're going to get shot and killed. Or whether it's the growth of anti-Semitism, the rise of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, the hate speech and hate crimes against Jews and Muslims. Or whether it's climate change and the rising sea levels and the devastating storms and the fires and the droughts that are costing lives and displacing people around the world. Or the millions of refugees who are just seeking safe haven. Or the immigrants in this country who are living in fear of deportation, of being torn from their families. Or women's rights to live without harassment and abuse and assault and to be able to control our own reproductive health. And on, the right of all people to have health care they can afford, the growing number of unemployed people in this country because of automation and economic globalization, their need to be retrained and have new opportunities or be able to form a union so that they can fight for their rights for working conditions and fair wages. Or the gaping chasm between rich and poor and the growing poverty in this country. So many places to put our attention, it can be overwhelming. But if we look carefully, we can see that there is a through line among all of these issues. There is a single thread that connects them all. And that thread can be expressed as one compound question. How much do we value Jewish life? No, that's not the question. How much do we value human life? And which lives do we value? That's the question. And I needed to bring you a text tonight that addressed that question. So I'm bringing you a text that contains a line that is so well known in the Jewish world, it's kind of become a platitude. It's lost its power. But what I want to do tonight is recontextualize that line in the whole text that it comes in. Because the whole text has, I think, all of what we need to be able to speak Torah to power in this moment in our country and in our world. So the text I'm bringing you tonight is from the Mishnah. And I first learned it in its entirety many years ago with Rabbi Sharon Brous. And some of the insights here came from her, and I thank her for that. The Mishnah was compiled by the rabbis. It was finished in the year 200, about 1,800 years ago. And in the Mishnah, the rabbis are trying to create a set of rules, of laws, of practices for Jewish society. What should Jewish society look like? How should we live in Jewish society? And in this part of the Mishnah, which is Mishnah Sanhedrin, they're specifically concerned with setting up Jewish courts because they are concerned about the power of courts to harm people or to kill people wrongly. They really want to figure out how do we create a fair, a just court system. And so here in this text, they are specifically thinking about the ways that judges should instruct witnesses in capital cases. And what they do is they want to make sure that witnesses are not going to come to the court and bring secondhand testimony or rumor or false testimony, but only eyewitness testimony that is true. And so they have to impress upon witnesses the gravity of their role, the weight of their role, the significance of their role, the consequences, the potential consequences and harmful consequences of their role. And so they have the judges tell the witnesses that there's a difference between monetary cases and capital cases. In a monetary case, if you make a mistake and you realize it later, you can pay the person back. You can make it right. In a capital case, you can't do that. You can't go back. If you make a mistake, you convict somebody and you kill them, there's no going back. And so this is what they want judges to tell witnesses. The judge says to the witness, in capital cases, the defendant's blood and the blood of all their future offspring hang on one until the end of the world, as we find with Cain, who killed his brother. As it says in Genesis 4:10, the bloods of your brother are screaming out. It does not say the blood of your brother, but the bloods of your brother, his blood and the blood of his future offspring. So let's look at this. The first thing that they're doing is they're comparing the witness and the defendant to brothers. They're saying, you're brothers. Second thing they're doing is they're saying, if you wrongfully convict somebody of a capital crime and you take their life, that is murder, like Cain and Abel. The third thing they're doing is they're saying, that person's blood is going to cry out from the ground, not just on the day of that person's death, but forever until the end of time. And not just that person's blood, but the blood of all of that person's descendants. They're noticing that in the Hebrew, it's not singular, it's plural. It's not dam, but it's dameh achicha, the bloods of your brother. And they're saying that plural form of dam, of blood, is coming to tell us that it's not just the blood of the person who dies, but it's the blood of their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren who never were born because of your action. And therefore, that blood will hang on you if you do this wrong thing forever until the end of time. And that's not all. They go on. They go on to say, and this is the line we know the best, they go on to say, the judge to the witness, "It was for this reason that the first human was created singly, to teach you that anyone who destroys a single life is considered by Scripture to have destroyed an entire world. And anyone who saves a single life is considered by Scripture to have saved an entire world." Now, when we hear this text, I think a lot of us, because we've heard it so many times, it sounds poetic. It sounds hyperbolic. But here, if you connect it to the text we just saw, the first part of the same text, what they're doing is they're saying that life has infinite value because it's not just the life you take, but it's all the lives that could come from that life forever and ever. In 10 generations, in 50 generations, in 100 generations, a world can be formed from each person. And that's why one life is worth the life of the whole world. And then I want to point out two other things in this text. One is when it says in the English, the first human, it's talking about the word Adam. And the word Adam we call Adam. But in Hebrew it's Adam. And it comes from the word Adamah, which means earth. Our ancestor was an earth creature, formed of the earth. We are made of earth. We belong to the earth. We are of the earth. And we are meant to live in a symbiotic relationship with the earth. So that's an important thing. And the second thing is we usually call Adam male. We think of it as he, him. Okay? But actually, Torah is totally explicit in saying that Adam was created male and female. Our ancestor is gender fluid, is transgender, is intersex. That's where we all come from, an earth creature that's gender fluid. The next thing I want to point out is that in my translation, I skipped a word. And that word in the Hebrew is mi Yisrael. And so what it actually says in the Hebrew is anyone who destroys a single life from Israel, from the Jewish people, is considered by Scripture to have destroyed an entire world. And the same for saving a life. It's specific, mi Yisrael. And the reason I didn't translate that word is because it actually would be a misrepresentation of this text to translate it. Because what it's talking about is purview and jurisdiction, not principle. These courts exist entirely within the Jewish world, entirely among the people of Israel. The court system is for Israel, the judges are Jews, the defendants are Jews, the witnesses are Jews. It only exists in that realm. That is the jurisdiction. But that is not the principle that's being conveyed. The principle that's being conveyed is about all human life. And sometimes, I think, we are timid about taking our texts and applying them universally. We make them overly particularistic. And this is an example of when not to do that, of when to make sure that the text that appears particularistic is actually applied as it should be in a universal way. And I bring that up because I think we ought to be doing that more boldly and more generally. And the rest of this text, as you'll see, makes it very clear that it's intended to be universalistic. One thing I want to point out before we move on is that if the rabbis were intending to be particularistic here, they could have used Abraham as our ancestor, who's the ancestor of all the Jewish people. But instead they use Adam and they use Abel, neither of whom were Jews, but both of whom are our ancestors of all people. But continuing, they go on to say further, the judge is still talking to the witness, and the rabbis are still teaching. Why do we come from one ancestor? So that, and for the sake of peace among people, that one person cannot say to their fellow, my parent was greater than your parent. So first we have the idea of the infinite value of human life. And then we have the idea of equality among all people without exception. And when we think about that blood crying out from the ground, what I think about is people like Tamir Rice and people like Sandra Bland. I think about people like Philando Castile, people whose lives were taken without even ever having a witness or a trial, and whose blood is crying from the ground, not just their blood, but the descendants that they never had. And I think about the kids at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, whose blood is crying from the ground, not just their blood, but the blood of their descendants who will never exist. And all people, this text says, are equal, without exception, and all lives have infinite value. And then it goes on to say, why do we have one ancestor? So that heretics won't say there are many powers in heaven. Because when we have divisions among us in the human family, It can feel as if those divisions are irreconcilable. It can feel as if they're unbridgeable. It can feel as if perhaps we come from different sources. Like we're never going to understand each other. But our tradition says, no, we come from one source. We come from one ancestor and one source of life. And so therefore, if anybody were to say something like, Muslims are satanic, Jews are satanic. We've heard both of these things, haven't we? That person saying that is demonstrating a fundamental misunderstanding about God and a fundamental misunderstanding about humanity and about the nature of the universe, because we come from one source and we are all family. They're not done, though. They go on to say, and why do we come from one ancestor? To tell of the grandeur of the Holy Blessed One, that a person stamps many coins with one stamp, and they're all the same, but the King of Kings, the Holy Blessed One, stamps each person with the stamp of the first person, but there isn't one of them who is just like another. Okay, so we have infinite value, every life. We are equal without exception. We are one human family, and our diversity is testament to God's greatness. Our diversity is what makes God great. It is the proof of God's grandeur. And here, now the text comes to my favorite part, I think maybe the most important part of the whole text. Therefore, each and every one of us must say, for my sake, the world was created. Now that's bold. Every human being on earth is obligated, the word is chayav, is obligated to say, the whole world was created so I could be in it. Imagine the implications of that. What it means is every single person has an inalienable dignity that cannot be stripped, that must never be stripped by any government, by any force, by any power. But it also has huge implications for public policy. Because if the world is only complete, creation only whole, when every person can fulfill their purpose on the earth, when that's why the earth was created, so that every single human being could be in it and have a role to play and have gifts to bring and have contributions to make, well then the purpose of government, the purpose of policy is to enable that to happen. And any policy that fails to make that happen is failing God's purpose, is failing the purpose of creation. And any policy, God forbid, that intentionally limits human potential and fulfillment is violating God's will. And so when we look at all the issues I named at the beginning, everything from healthcare to poverty to autocratic regimes to climate change to gun violence, anything like that, where our governments are failing and our policy is failing to care for and nourish and nurture every human life, is a violation of God's will. We are living at a time when there will be increasing pressure to devalue human life. There are 7.6 billion people on the earth, and the projection is that in 30 years there will be 9 billion people on the earth. With climate change, there will be more and more people displaced, more and more migration, more and more refugees. We're going to see increasing numbers of candidates like the one occupying the Oval Office. People who come to power by scapegoating groups of people. And the question is going to be, how much do we value human life, and which lives do we value? And I bring you this text because as Jews, this is what we stand for. What we need to do is plant our feet and square our shoulders and say, we are Jews. We believe that human life has infinite value. We believe that all human beings are equal without exception. We believe that we are one human family, and even when it seems like we are so divided from each other and we'll never find each other again, we have faith, we believe, we know we come from one source, and we know we can find each other. We know we can bridge our differences. And our diversity, our Torah teaches us, our diversity is what testifies to God's greatness. And we stand for policy, for government, in which we have a radical humanity, meaning a radical humaneness, meaning we champion human life, all of it. And that is what we stand for as Jews. Whatever issue you're working on, of the many that I listed and maybe some that I didn't list, they're connected, all the issues, by the question of how much we value human life and which lives we value. And this is the Torah that we're here to teach about the infinite value of human life. This is the way we speak Torah to power. Thank you.